Thank you for joining us for this very special event, the Vincent Scully Memorial. Scully joined this faculty in 1991, bringing his matchless scholarship and brilliant mind to help shape the University of Miami School of Architecture in its defining years. He delivered his last lecture here in April 2011, so I personally never had the chance to experience the Scully phenomenon in Miami, and sadly, didn't get to know him like you did. My admiration for Vincent Scully is for Scully, the intellectual, the formidable historian who has single-handedly transformed his field by reaffirming the humanist cast. For most of you here, though, this is an occasion to celebrate the man as much as the scholar, to remember him as a colleague, a mentor, and as a friend. For surely Vincent has touched you with his kindness and his generosity as much as with his ideas. Although I haven't had the chance to enjoy his company and the opportunity to exchange ideas, to share beliefs, or even meals, I do appreciate what he has given this community, and I'm profoundly grateful for his gift to the school. Our school is what it is today, partly because of what he brought to it, because how he framed a collective vision and helped articulate its unique voice. He spoke of a so-called School of Miami to describe a school of thought, a shared sensibility and philosophy, as much as an institution. And in an indirect fashion, I feel like I do know him because I sense his palpable influence on this community. There is a trace of Scully in every one of us, and yes, I truly hope in myself included. I'll stop here to allow the people who knew Vincent Scully more than vicariously to speak now, beginning with Dean Elizabeth Blatter-Zybeck, who actually brought him here to us.
Thank you, Dean. Professor Scully represents a powerful era for architecture and urbanism, a time when, after the hiatus of early modernism, architecture reconnected with its history, and architects once again began to seek in our work to bridge the achievements of our predecessors and a future of continuity. Today's program represents the influence that Professor Scully has had over a half-century of teaching, writing, and civic engagement, and its continuing relevance for us all. Historian Richard John will describe the context for Professor Scully's work. There will follow three groups of speakers. Now I'm explaining the program for you. Three groups of speakers with film clips interspersed. The first group is Professor Scully's students of various times from Yale and Miami, then Vincent Happy's Miami friends, followed by School of Architecture faculty, and a closing by Tappy Lynn. Afterwards, all are invited to join in conversation and refreshments in Korach Gallery. I must take a moment to thank all who helped produce this event today. Dean El Khoury, Carrie Penabad, Gilda Santana, Yvonne de la Paz, Ray San Cristobal, Sylvia Alvarez, Nicole Hejazi, and Zoila Lopez. The films were produced by Checkerboard and the Museum of Modern Art. Richard?
Liz has asked me to say a few words about the historiographical context, and I am very honored to do so. I first read Professor Scully's The Earth, the Temple and the Gods when I was 18 and a second-year undergraduate at Cambridge. I had just switched from reading medical sciences to history of art and was reading voraciously in the hope of catching up in the subject, which was quite new to me. Though my professors that semester were acclaimed scholars, they were not inspiring teachers. Their lectures were filled with a faithful recitation of names and dates, and the slides we were shown were carefully selected to demonstrate precisely which source an architect or artist had borrowed from for the ornament of a frieze, or the pose of a figure, or the iconography of an object. It was a very learned discourse, not yet affected by the jargon of the new art history, and rooted in a solid Germanic tradition of cataloguing facts and categorizing styles. Vincent Scully's book, which sought to understand how the Greeks embodied their deities in their sanctuaries through the total experience of the temples in their natural settings, could not have offered a more different view of what architectural history could be. I found it utterly compelling and literally eye-opening, in that it showed how one might, by combining a supreme leap of historical imagination with a penetrating visual examination, try to see how ancient buildings were seen by those who had built them. This profoundly empathetic approach, which has its roots in Geoffrey Scott's Architecture of Humanism and Henri Faucillon's La Vie des Formes, was unsurprisingly rejected by classical archaeologists, entrenched as they were in narrow conventions of German scholarship. Professor Scully was not deterred, however, and went on to apply the same poetic sensibility to his immersive studies of other cultures and places, notably the people and landscapes of the American Southwest, in Pueblo, mountain, village, dance, and the French 17th century garden, amongst other topics in architecture, the natural and the man-made. This understanding of how buildings and places can evoke in humans a psychological and visceral response was key to the spellbinding quality of his lectures. His audience was borne along with him on a magic carpet ride, seeing and experiencing, as he had done, across great expanses of time and space. A lecture which began by comparing Frank Gehry's Bilbao Guggenheim with a French Gothic cathedral might take one back at one moment to the very earliest human paintings in the cave at Chauvet, 32,000 BC, then to the athletes competing at Olympia, or to the haunting scream of Lutyens's memorial to the dead of the Somme at Thiepval. Through his writing and teaching, Professor Scully showed that the scope of the architectural historian could be vastly expanded in terms of both the methodological and analytical tools available to us and the boundaries of the subject itself, so that it might encompass urbanism, vernacular buildings, and the natural landscape. He demonstrated the immense value of breaking out of a narrow academic silo, focused monographically on a single period, style, architect, or building, to give us an expansive and inspiring vision of nothing less than the great arc of human history.
When you're teaching an introductory course in the history of art, you had to first convince the students that it was possible to have aesthetic reactions, visual reactions. They hadn't been educated that way. So first of all, you see they had to trust the instructor. He was, in fact, having these feelings and these scenes and these perceptions. Then they have to think it is possible for themselves to have such feelings. Then they have to pretend to have such feelings. And then they have them.
I'm Alex Gorlin. In 1978, I arrived at Yale from the Cooper Union. It was a cloistered academy of modernism, where Le Corbusier was the only architect worthy of study. I had heard Vincent Scully speak only once before at the Institute of Architecture and Urban Studies, where I thought he was electrifying, so much so that Peter Eisenman, the director of the Institute and one of my teachers, spent the entire class the next day discussing how dangerous Vince was and the ideas that he represented, that architecture was not purely a formal abstract exercise, but about how people actually used and responded to architecture. Those were the days of they were called the whites and the grays. I decided then and there, when I graduated, to go to Yale to study with Vince, who was a great breath of fresh air. And for me, it was a great awakening. Architecture was concerned with history, with landscape, with architects such as Robert Venturi. It was a dialogue over time between different styles and the importance of social housing, such as the mighty Karl Marx Hof, that architecture had a social obligation to actually better society. It was Vince's inspiration that caused me to expand my own practice beyond houses for the 1% to design affordable housing and housing for the homeless. After graduation in New York, while I was working at the corporate firm of Cohn Pedersen Fox, I got a call one day from Vince, who said that fall in 1986, he was going to be on sabbatical, and would I teach his modern architecture course? I was speechless. I thought I was not worthy of this great honor, and what great shoes to fill. I was certain, though, that Vince would lend me his notes and slides so that it would make it more possible to do this course. But he said, "Oh, no, 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 you should tell your own story." And this, to me, was a great example of how he encouraged young people to find their own way. So in a great panic, I packed my bags and moved to New Haven, and I threw myself into the task and came up with my own course on modern architecture. I arrived at the class for the first lecture and not knowing if anyone would show up, and to my surprise, many, many students were there. And after the first lecture, I actually got applause. So I proudly told Vince, and he said, "No, now, don't let that get to your head. That's not the point of teaching." So to me, that was a great lesson in modesty. Then finally, Vince called one day and asked if I would give him some advice on a house he was going to build in Brantford for himself and Catherine Lynn. And I, of course, assumed he was going to ask me to design it, like he had asked Frank Lloyd Wright to design a house for him years ago. Of course, that didn't quite work out very well. But he said, "Oh, no, no, I'm going to design it. I just want your recommendation from one of your students to build it." So I recommended Jamie Doyle, who started off with great enthusiasm, and then I discovered he disappeared one day to go up to Martha's Vineyard and work on Jackie Onassis's house that Hugh Jacobson had designed. And then Vince called up and said, "You get Jamie back here." So I called Jamie and I said, "Who is this Jackie O, and what has she done for you?" So he got back to New Haven and he finished the house, and of course, one should be a man of their word.
Good afternoon, everybody. And Tappy, it's a pleasure to be here with you. It's great to have an opportunity to talk about Vince. He was a seminal character in my life in many different fashions and at many different times. I was fortunate to be one of those students who had the opportunity to study under him at Yale and take his undergraduate architectural history class. It was a class filled with surprises, revelations, and delight for me. It caused me to look at architecture in a way that I hadn't previously. But what it led to was even more singular than the class itself, which was in my third year at Yale, I asked Vince and Charlie Moore if they would do an independent study with me on how to teach people to be architects. It probably was one of the seminal moments of my time at Yale because I got to listen to these two very smart intellectuals argue with each other for 3 hours a day, once a week for a semester. It probably was also the easiest class I ever took because there was not space for me to put a word in edgewise. But what was interesting about it is that their two different approaches to architecture were clear in their two different approaches to teaching architecture. Vince was a man of rigor, of going from A to B to C to D, who had a real intellectual approach to how we study and make architecture. Charlie, on the other hand, was all about how it felt. If it felt good, it was fine. And that was the long and the short of it. For me, the two different viewpoints have formed my office, because we must use Vince's rigor in how we approach our buildings, but our measure as to whether or not they're good is to how they feel. So for us, both aspects of how you look at architecture were extraordinarily important. I opened my practice in Washington in 1976, and it was the time that Washington was passing its very, very historic preservation laws, and became one of the toughest places in the U.S. to build. Fortunately for me, I had studied under Vince, because I had a language and an ability to look at context and understand context. I came to Yale as the modernist that so many of us who left Yale at the point I did. And had I not taken Vince's classes, had I not had the ability to study under him, context would have been foreign to me. I would have had no idea as to how to approach this very, very complex thing called historic architecture and historic preservation. Because of this knowledge of contextualism, my practice in Washington flourished, and I became the bane of every architectural critic in the United States. They wrote more nasty articles about me than I think they have about anybody. I gave a speech in 1980 in New York, and Herbert Mouchamp attended, and my goal was to have him walk out. My view is if I could get Herbert Mouchamp to walk out of my lecture, I knew I had succeeded. He did. I was pleased. And I still give parts of that lecture today. But going back to Vince, I did start my practice in Washington, and it was through understanding history and the history of architecture and where I fit in that I was able to make my practice. It never would have occurred without my studying with Vince, and I have to say the dialogue between Vince and Charlie Moore was really central to my ability to cope with the new world that condemned historic architecture and only celebrated that which had not been seen before, which I've always thought is a very peculiar measure of quality, just something that has not been seen before. I kept in touch with Vince over the years. He wrote the introduction to a book on my work, which I was very flattered that he was willing to do. And over the years, I became a board member of the National Building Museum. The Building Museum gave an honor award for people who had contributed significantly to the built environment. And many of their people were important people. Lady Bird Johnson was one of them, Irwin Miller, people who are central to having perfected and changed how we approach the built environment. For years, I suggested that Vince be a recipient of the honor award. As this is the case in so many institutions, these prizes are a thinly veiled excuse for fundraising, and are as much about how much money they can raise on the person being honored as they are about the substance of the honor. I'm not on the board of the Building Museum anymore, or I would not be saying this. But after a while, I became really tired of their rejection of Vince, and I said, okay, guys, I'll tell you what. I want you to let me create a prize in Vince's honor. I think it's important to have something that promotes conversation about the built environment. One of the things I had learned by being so unattractive to the architecture critics is that there was a dialogue going on that we all had to participate in whether we wanted to or not, and nobody was going to leave us alone to practice architecture as we wanted to. So the museum finally agreed, and they let me do my thing. And as I think a remarkable tribute to Vince, Vince's students contributed over $1 million to endow the prize, which I think really talks about Vince's importance to lots and lots of people. It is now one of the most sought after and respected prizes in the built environment. Its winners include Yaga Khan, Jane Jacobs, the Prince of Wales, Liz and Andres, scores of really important people who have contributed a great deal to our conversation about the built environment. And I think it is a real tribute to Vince as well as to the awardees that all of these people have so much appreciated winning the award and said that it was a great honor for them. Thank you.
Thank you for having me as part of this. I appreciate that, and seeing all old colleagues and friends. My remembrance of Vince today will perhaps be on a slightly more personal level than others, as our involvement with he and Tappy came during an eventful and meaningful time in our lives. And I'm saying our because I'm speaking not just for myself, but for my wife and partner, Marianne, who was with me throughout that period. I had had some interaction with Vince here at UM when he first came here, and I was lucky enough to be included in the Between Two Towers book that he was writing at the time. But the more meaningful relationship that I speak of developed a few years later when I entered the Graduate School of Architecture at Yale. I quickly found that the nurturing and creative environment here at UM had ill-prepared me for the hollowed-out bunker that was the Yale School of Architecture at the time. Luckily, this was a condition that Dean Bob Stern would remedy in his arrival the following year. In any case, I turned to Vince and Tappy in despair, not knowing if I should even continue. They, of course, gave me immediate support and sympathy and helped me find my way into a small research program within the school where I could pursue independent work. And this work fortuitously evolved into a collaboration with them on a book on Yale and New Haven's urban and architectural history that the university had commissioned from them. And they were as amazed as I was at such a turn of events. As Marianne is fond of recounting, they told her at one point, "We knew Eric could draw, so we never imagined that he could also write." So this collaboration was made even more meaningful because it seemed to be both a personal and professional homecoming of sorts for both Vince and myself. He, of course, spent his whole life in New Haven and Yale, and the importance of urbanism and community had steadily grown in his work and had been instrumental in his decision to come here to UM. And I had grown up in a small town just outside New Haven and have been firmly grounded in the importance of urban history by the wonderful faculty and colleagues here today. So what had started out as a dark time for me was thoroughly redeemed by Vincent Tappy's generosity and support. That generosity extended into our personal lives as well. They graciously offered us the opportunity to house sit their home in New Haven when they were in Miami, and several years later when we had returned to Miami, we did the same in their Coral Gables cottage. So we are left with the wonderful memories of our first daughter, Ava, taking her very first steps in their New Haven living room. And just a year later, we started our own architectural practice in their Coral Gables living room, overlooking the beautiful garden. I don't want to end before acknowledging by far the most important part of Vince's life, at least as we saw it, was Tappy. We saw firsthand how integral she was to not only his life, but to his work. She supported and contributed to every aspect of it and was instrumental to my own small contribution. Thank you, Tappy, for everything you did, you and Vince did for Marianne and I, and for all of us here. Thank you.
Well, I have two little stories. They're bookends of sorts. One, and they both have what has come to be called the shock of the new. Vince provided two shocks in my life. One was when I arrived at Yale, I met him, and the other one was when he arrived in Miami, and I saw him again on a completely different light. And the first story is about a very, very big thing that has become so commonplace that it's a small thing we don't even think about. And then the other one was about a very little thing that then became very large. They're really quite the opposite. When Alex mentioned that at Cooper Union, all that was studied was Le Corbusier, he was not exaggerating. No one else was mentioned at Princeton. There was no Lou Kahn, there was no Frank Lloyd Wright, there was no Alvar Aalto. There was Le Corbusier and a little bit of Mies, and it was all formal analysis. And when I arrived at Vincent's first lecture, and he began speaking about Sullivan and Wright and the various architects of the shingle style, I was completely shocked and actually offended. It's almost hard to reconstruct. I said, but what is this drivel? You know, who are these people? and of course now integrating American architecture into the discourse. We all now study American architecture, but how rare that was for our generation. And so this introduction of Vince of American architecture into the highest level of discourse actually is something everyone does now, but it was actually literally shocking then, and it's become a normal thing. The other one was when Vince and Tappy arrived in Miami, and I just couldn't wait. And one of the things that I was dedicated to is what I call mainlining them into Miami and the Caribbean so they could get on with it, you know, and get rid of that New England. And let's just have them understand what this was about. And so I would drive them around watching not only the old Coral Gables houses, but the great work that appeared in Between Two Towers ultimately, you know, the work of our faculty and students. And he would keep getting excited about little ranch houses. I could not believe it. And I had that shock again. I said, but Vince, we're now about to go see a building by Porto Hondo. He says, but look at that ranch house. And I remember looking out the window and saying, and of course, he was right. And I would say that take on the incredible sort of dignity of the American vernacular, which actually he shows he would speak about in the Wislak and Trabaki house in Nantucket. He actually immediately assimilated and understood with these little ranch houses were in Fort Lauderdale. It was very, very, very modest, and it did affect me, and actually my interest over time has become in ever more modest buildings. And I'm afraid that this very little thing has become or should be a very big thing. We should really be looking at vernacular architecture, our vernacular architecture, and not be raised and lifted to the esoteric higher levels. And then one anecdote that means a lot to me might mean nothing to anyone else. But one day he looked at me and said, Andres, you have a redneck streak. And I have never been more proud of a compliment. Because I really do. And it has been very useful to understand that he admires that range. And so I deploy it actually more and more often than you would want to hear. Thank you, Vince.
1950, I was lucky enough to get a Fulbright. Went to Rome. Italy was wonderful at that time. And there I was lucky enough to see Greek temples for the first time. It's at Pestum. The very first slide I ever took is one that became the frontispiece for my book later, The Earth, the Temple, and the Gods. It made me see that everything is related to everything else, and that all human structures are related to the natural world. Divinity in nature, divinity as imagined by mankind. No resolution between the two. Nature implacable, the human will unbreakable.
The Acropolis, of course, this is the best view of it. You see it with the sacred mountain, that is with Hymettus. And you see especially the horns of Hymettus over there. And as you know, the temple of Athena Polias, the sacred temple right in the middle, is oriented directly at those horns.
It's very unfashionable because nobody believes in the Olympian gods, but it's the most intense religious experience I ever had.
The natural voice down here is heard perfectly up at the top. Just perfectly.
That trip to Greece, that work I did in Greece, was the most important that ever happened to me. And it still informs my life to a certain extent.
Kai aorimoi, halados eresma, kleina athanai, daimonion petroliathron. How's that?
I don't know that I belong up here after that. My name is Dean Ziff. I have a brief tale to tell, but it helps, I think, to give some context to Vince Scully's early attachment with our exotic part of the world. In 1991, when Vince and Tappy arrived in town to look for temporary lodgings, Professor Victoria suggested they visit our gatehouse by Vizcaya, which had an interesting history. It was designed and built by Stanford White's son for his sister in the 20s. And the same property was the site where Tennessee Williams stayed in the 40s and again in the 50s when he staged several of his plays at the Coconut Grove Theater, as it was called back then, including a revival of A Streetcar Named Desire in 1956, which Tennessee Williams directed himself. This creative history intrigued Vince and Tappy, but Vince reacted, I think, more so to the thick native hardwood hammock in which the gatehouse was nestled. It moved him on the spot. He launched into one of his highly animated and joyful eruptions of emotional connection to the primal beauty of the place. He said his creative juices were stoked by the raw, gigantic power of the banyans and the palpable dampness within the shade of the tropical forest. He thought the big leaves were fantastic. This was all very bizarre to a Connecticut Yankee. Vince and Tappy took the gatehouse for a couple of semesters. It was there, sitting upstairs at his desk, looking out into the tangled vines and untamed landscape of primitive early Miami, that Vince wrote the whole of architecture, the natural and the man-made. He said it just flowed out of him, and he loved the process. How fortunate are we in Miami that Vince graced us and Tappy graced us with their extraordinary personalities and intellect. A rich passing moment. And that's my brief tale.
Hi, I'm Beth Dunlop. I've been really moved by the talk so far, I have to say, and I'm really privileged to be here. And I was thinking that so many of us have this indelible memory of when we first heard Vince talk or when we first met Vince. And mine is kind of funny because I was about 19. I was a sophomore at Vassar College, and I don't exactly remember why I was going to New Haven or even how I got there. But a friend of mine said, you know, there's this class you should stop in on, and people just come and sit in on it all the time. And so I went, and even though I don't even remember if I drove my brother's electric blue 1964 Mustang or my roommate's VW Beetle, I do remember Vince. I remember sitting there, I remember the voice, the cadence, the subject and the substance, and the extraordinarily beautiful language. I grew up with words and buildings. My mother was an editor, my father was a building contractor, but I don't think it was until I sneaked into that Yale classroom that I understood the relationship between the two. Before Vince, they were separate entities. They were my mother and my father. Since then, I've had numerous opportunities to bask in that glorious language. The language Vince used to talk about the history of architecture and to bask in the emotion and drama of his delivery. When he first started teaching here in Miami, I would drop my son at his elementary school and then drive like mad to get to the Gussman Auditorium. I think I managed to hear all but about one or two of the lectures over the course of maybe 3 years. My memory of them may be a little episodic because I don't think I heard them in order, but I remember the thrumming of his fingers when he talked about the Hopis. I'll never forget that. And I remember the raw, vast sweep of emotion when he talked about Lutyens and Maya Lin, and, indelible. Later, I was lucky enough to have that same son who was deposited in elementary school go to Yale, which to me meant that I got to hear more of Vince Scully's lectures. And I was also lucky enough to develop, and I really mean lucky, to develop a friendship with Vincent Tappy and to get to talk about a range of subjects with them, from architecture to art, to movies and dogs and football and cars and grilled cheese sandwiches, and even learning to like the Greek spirit ouzo. Seriously. And what strikes me about, as I thought back, what strikes me about every one of those subjects is that Vince could make a really mundane topic into a magical moment. And there were some other, even more, I'm going off topic a little, but there were some moments that I'll never forget, like when he told a group of us, most of whom are in this, many of whom are in this room right now, he was having a conversation with Shu Bassett, and they were talking about Frank Lloyd Wright and Marcel Breuer and Joseph and Annie Albers, and I thought, oh my gosh, I am, right this moment, I am living history. It was so astounding to understand everything he'd been witness to, and yet the next day be able to talk to him about a grilled cheese sandwich. About 20 years ago, I wrote a book on Disney architecture, and I was awed and honored by the fact that Vince wrote the foreword to it. I was even more awed and honored that he really liked my approach to the subject, which was kind of anthropological, and he said so in the foreword. But mostly I was just awed by what he wrote, which was in turn intellectual, polemical, personal, passionate, and totally down to earth. I hope I will always be able to adhere to those traits as benchmark for all that I do in life. My favorite sentence from the foreword Vince wrote to this long out-of-print book, Building a Dream, reads this way: "When you wish upon a star, it makes a lovely fiction for a while, especially when it is sung in front of Cinderella Castle with the magic animals capering about, but it is, after all, pure bullshit in the long run." And I walk my dog a lot these days, and when I'm out on my street, I often think of Vince. His voice rings in my head as I look at the houses I'm walking past. There are Mediterranean and Deco-ish houses from the 1920s and 30s, and early modernist houses from the 1940s and 1950s, ranch houses, Andreas. And tragically enough, too many really horrible houses from the last decade or so where developers, the city zoning laws, and yes, the architects showed almost no respect to the land, the landscape, the block, the street, or the city. Vince helped me have a clear mind when I think about architecture and urbanism, and a strong voice when I write. And really, because this isn't always that easy to say what I think. In the end, it's bullshit. He was the master. Let me say that again. He was the master, and his words and ideas transformed the way so many of us see the world around us, even during a dog walk. He knew, and so we know, that everything we build has meaning, that everything we build shapes who we are and how we behave. More than anyone ever, he taught us that no structure is insignificant, that every stick and every stone is part of our larger culture, our civilization. And he told us that in language that was intellectual, polemical, personal, passionate, and totally down to earth.
Hi, Vince. Oscar Levant, the crazy pianist, once said, "So little time, so little to do." There's really little time for me to speak and little to do because you all know about Vince and you can read and you can appreciate him. My first experience meeting him was incredible. Beth, who's probably told 1 million people to go sit in on Vince's lectures, told me to go, and I did. I sat in the back. I got there late, and it was totally dark. And because I had all kinds of vision problems, I was stumbling around in the dark, and all of a sudden I heard this incredible voice, and it was Vince. And the range was incredible. And then the room was enlightened. And so I sat there and I thought, this is an incredible situation. Everything I ever thought about has come together, like a man taking shards of glass and putting them into a kaleidoscope and then having this great symmetry. So I left vowing to come back, and I decided I'd make my schedule so that as long as he was here, I could come on these Tuesdays and Thursdays. And I ran into a situation where I was doing pro bono and trying to stop a 40-story tower building on the end of Ocean Drive, the north end. And I went to see the people on the other side, and I said, rather than litigate, why don't we mitigate and have a mediator come in? And I said, because this building is turning its back on the natural resource, this great beach that goes for miles, that is separated from the buildings by Ocean Drive, and you're at the end, and you turn away from that. And the attorney on the other side said, are you crazy? What are you talking about? And if we did go to a mediator, who would be the mediator? And I said, I'm suddenly thinking, this didn't come out of my mind. It came out of listening to those lectures in the dark with the relationship of building to nature. And I said, well, what about Vince Scully? And the guy said, now you're really crazy. Vince Scully, the voice of the Dodgers? And I said, no, not Vince Scully, the voice of the Dodgers. Vince Scully, the voice of rationality and art and architecture. And he said, well, I've never heard of him. I'll ask Isesaki. And so he said, you must be out of your mind, though. And he called me back and he said, I'm humbled. Isesaki would be honored to meet Vince Scully. So they met. And Vince pointed out some ways in which the building could be redesigned, and Isesaki said, thank you very much. I'm going to incorporate all of these ideas. Now, unfortunately, as life would have it, the building didn't get built. But I did get to meet Vince, and I did get to attend these wonderful courses that went on and on for years, and I met Tappy and Vince, and I always felt, and I still feel, that when Tappy and Vince came into a room, you should raise your glasses and toast them. It was a wonderful thing, and I'm delighted to see all of you here to remember and continue remembering Vince Scully.
See the whole urban structure. That's what it's all going to be about. Not individual buildings, but the relationship of everything to the natural world and to each other. You see the basic New Haven housing type, wooden houses, 3 stories tall, frontal gable on the street, all making this wonderful crystalline structure and making those wonderful streets. This is a great view. As a matter of fact, it's more than a great view, it's kind of encyclopedic. You really can see the way architecture is the city. You cannot invent urbanism. This wonderful order of this street is grown up because that's the way people have wanted to live for a long time. I remember going down streets like this with my seminar, and I'd been writing about American vernacular architecture for a long time, but I'd been so marinated in modernism, it never occurred to me you could use it again.
Good afternoon. My name is Rocco Cheo. I'm on the faculty here at the School of Architecture. Thank you, Tappy. In my mind, without any doubt, one of Vincent Scully's greatest talents as a historian was his uncanny ability to empathize with his subject. Vincent could grasp what was for so many historians so difficult to attain, an intimacy with the creative process of those they wrote about. Vincent could feel the motivations of the architects he wrote about and put into words the evolution of ideas as they unfolded. This singular gift is of great use to young architects and aspiring artists who want more than anything else to know how it is done. One seminal example of this is a little-known article written in 1952 for the first issue of Perspecta, the Yale Architectural Journal. The title of the essay is, of course, Michelangelo's Fortification Drawings, a Study in the Reflex Diagonal. In this article, Vincent tells of Michelangelo's conflicted nature as witnessed in the drawings for the bastions and gates for the defense of the city of Florence made between 1527 and 1529. And I want to read you a short passage just to give you a sense of Vincent's style and the way he connected. He said, "Visually in plan, the form becomes an explosive nugget, which, though strictly controlled by its own harmonics of cohesion, nevertheless directs infinitely extensible axis of space. More than this, the new diagonal reflexes and the interpenetrating spaces become obsessive. One can feel them working strong chemical changes in the mind and arm muscles of Michelangelo. With the drunkenness of discovery, they insist upon the fulfillment of their will to form. This happens because while they are controlled eventually by geometry, they are in their basic energies the very opposite of what is often called today formalistic design. The power of the sensuously felt diagonal to destroy boundaries and to create reflex makes them live and grow as spatial forms." This was Vincent just 6 years after returning from World War II and a couple of years into his full-time appointment to the faculty at Yale as an assistant professor in art history. The article is also the foundation to celebrated works by other historians, such as James Ackerman's work on Michelangelo. And in Scully's article are more of the important ideas Ackerman espouses in his work on the architecture of Michelangelo, published 9 years after Scully's article. The article forms the foundation for the use of the diagonal in architecture and places the work of Frank Lloyd Wright and others in historical context while connecting the sculpture, painting, and urbanism of Michelangelo to the idea of the reflex diagonal. The ability of Vincent to allow us to share in the creative process and the feelings and motivations of others through his writings was one of his great gifts. I, for one, will not forget his unique ability to connect us with the minds as well as the work of extraordinary individuals. Vincent was one of those people.
So I knew Vincent Scully years before I met him in the spring of 1992 when he began teaching at the University of Miami. I knew him through The Earth, the Temple, and the Gods, his book on the monuments of Greek antiquity, just as Professor John has laid out. As an undergraduate studying architecture in an era in which modernism was the unquestioned ethos, the history of architecture seemed to be focused on facts of buildings, which situated them within an ossified matrix. The Earth, the Temple, and Gods was a revelatory discovery. Page 1 begins. The mountains and valleys of Greece were punctuated during antiquity by hard, white forms touched with bright colors which stood out in geometric contrast to the shapes of the earth. These were the temples of the gods. By the bottom of page 6, Scully is exhorting us to go beyond the analysis based on positivistic criteria by invoking Herman Melville, a modern man like ourselves, may have perceived the essentials when he wrote his poetically questionable but conceptually exact 4 lines entitled Greek Architecture. Not magnitude or lavishness, but form the sight. Not innovating willfulness, but reverence for the archetype. Scully continues, therefore, when Melville, as a typically querulous and modern traveler, mounted the Acropolis of Athens one day in 1857, he was able to understand all at once the miracle of reconciliation between men and nature, which rose before his eyes. A white presence stood before him, high on its platform of rock, above a long view to the sea. That was a rivetingly different approach to architectural history, one that, in addition to the facts and close observations, looked to the affect of buildings and the landscape, and even invoked the gods as participants in that project. I was so converted to this approach that I toured the temples of the Peloponnesus the following summer with Scully's book as a guide. It changed my understanding of architecture, and in that I'm one of many thousands affected by Vincent Scully. He taught not just students of architecture and art, but undergraduates from across all the disciplines. And thus, in the spring of 1992, when Scully began teaching at Miami, then University President Tad Foote welcomed his former teacher and sat in on his course for a second time. Scully had the unique capacity to reframe the prevailing perceptions of the time. He consistently challenged the enframing orthodoxy of modernism, which had largely stripped architecture of its narrative arc. He said in a 2004 interview in the Yale Bulletin, "What I learned as time went on was that modernism was faulty in view of what architecture was, that it was a simplistic view of architecture. It was predicated on an arbitrary aesthetic." Scully's assessment was humanistic, full of passion and empathy, and through his assessment, he gave life to architecture, both historic and contemporary. Vincent Scully always looked for the underlying narrative. And I can't say that when I toured the Peloponnesus, I saw everything that Melville did. I certainly saw infinitely more with Scully's help. And it's my sincere hope that our students continue to find the essence of meaning in architecture that Vincent Scully revealed to me.
Hello, my name is Carrie Penabad, and I'm honored to be here remembering Vincent, and I'm delighted to see you, Tappy, back in Miami. So like Dean, I'm going to share a short story with you. It was a cool February morning in Coral Gables, and I was heading to Vincent and Tappy's house for my regular meetings with Tappy. She and I were collaborating on a book chronicling the life and work of Marion Manley, Miami's first woman architect. And I was coming over to review the latest progress on my individual book chapters. For me, Tappy was much more than a collaborator. She was a generous mentor who I had grown to greatly admire and still do. Before I could ring the doorbell, Tappy greeted me with her customary Southern charm and elegance and apologized for the fact that she had to step out for a moment to walk Aldo, their beautiful husky. So she hurried off as I stepped inside and I set down my things. A few minutes later, I walked across the room to look at a book on one of the many bookshelves in the house. And I found myself standing in the hallway just outside of where Vincent was working. I have to admit that for a moment, I thought I should step back into the living room, but I was captivated by the scene. Vincent sat at his desk with his full box of slides to one side and his carousels on the other. Books lay everywhere, and light poured into the room from all sides. The window by his desk framed a view of the majestic gumbo limbo tree that stood just outside the edges of the house. From my vantage point, the scene laid out like a painting, with Vincent, the great New England scholar, dressed elegantly in his tweed jacket, set against the backdrop of the lush subtropical garden. He lifted one slide in his right hand, setting it against the light to be able to discern the image. He then searched for the accompanying slide with his left hand, now raising them both into the air as a pair. He alternated the slides several times until he seemed satisfied that the coupling could describe the story he wanted to share. He dropped the slide pair into the carousels, and then he began the process over again, searching for the next diptych that could illustrate the passionate story that he was to deliver in class the following day. What moved me about watching Vince that day was both the display of reverence for the material and the intense and meticulous crafting of the images before him. Let's face it, he could have stepped into the classroom the next day with little to no preparation. After all, he had written numerous books which had become fundamental texts in the discipline, and he had lectured on these subjects for nearly 40 years at Yale. I am certain that anything that he would have said to the group of young undergraduate students and visitors the following day would have impressed. And yet, he was carefully crafting this lecture as though it were his first, with a reverence and a passion for the art of teaching that was both humbling and inspiring to the young teacher that was watching him. I will be forever grateful to Vincent and Tappy for the invaluable lessons that both I and Adib learned in their classrooms. These include the search for meaning in architecture, the pursuit of beauty, the building of communities and cities capable of creating more perfect societies, and the revelation that architecture had both a corporal and a spiritual dimension. On that February afternoon, in their house in Coral Gables, I witnessed firsthand the intense preparation that went into each seemingly effortless performance. For after all, that is what Vincent's lectures were: captivating narratives that carried you away with him into the world that he had carefully crafted for us all.
Good afternoon. My name is Roberto Bejar. Thank you for having me, Elise. Thank you for including me. Vincent Scully writes the shingle style and sticky style when modernism is the law of the land and history is to be forgotten. In the book, he reminds us of the extraordinary inventions like the Low House by McKean, Mead and White, and in turn call us to discover the simple, direct beauty of American colonial architecture. The book is perhaps the first public declaration of Vincent's independence of mind and courage to speak truth to power. Rosario Marco and I were super lucky to walk with Vincent and Tape the Yale campus and the streets of Rome and Ostia Antigua, and to learn firsthand how these twin passions of his life come together in his support of the work of Louis Kahn. In these walks, I also learned of Haskell Tower as a kind of portrait of Yale, and the role played by Oldenburg's lipstick sculpture at Beinecke Plaza in bringing students together to disguise resistance to the Vietnam War at Yale. New and old, ancient, Gothic, and pop coming together in a project without preconditions or limits as a symbol of the freedom of art, architecture, and life. After an incredible exercise in collective disciplinary amnesia, Vincent Scully brought back to life ancient Greeks and ancient Americans, temples and pueblos, Mayan pyramids and New York skyscrapers, daring to suggest a world without dogmas, where everything is possible, and all of the gods are invited in the ideal house of memory. Vincent's introductions to Robert Venturi's Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture, and his text on Aldo Rossi's scientific autobiography and his first American monograph on his work, brought the two artists together as complementary figures where passion for the future of the city and architecture's cultural endeavor become part of a multifaceted understanding of architecture. But perhaps for us here in Miami today, his most important lesson was to help us understand who we are and the unique contribution we can make to the world of architecture at large from this very School of Architecture here in Miami. Thank you, Vincent, for your lifelong independence of mind and passion for architecture and life. Thank you, Vincent, for teaching us how to be free.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Tappy, for offering this opportunity to remember Vincent, say a few words of our memories of him. And Liz, thank you for putting this together. I'd like to share a memory and an anecdote from our time with Vince. The memory is from the first time we met him. We met him in London, the first Open City Studio, a studio that was sponsored by John Steffian, the then chair of the School of Architecture, I think, and Sarah Steffian. Vince and Tappy visited often and reviewed the work of the students. They loved the work of the students. They liked the studio and what the intentions were of the studio, which was a surprise to us. He knew New London well. He knew New England. He knew New London well. And he would, with his classical mind, equate, for instance, O'Neill's plays with Greek drama. Because Vince, by the way, was a classicist different from the type that distracts us today, you know, the syntax, classical architect, or an architecture that is based on language. He was the Greek classicist of our childhood, the Hector and the Achilles and the Agamemnon and the Medea. It was odd to see this all in front of us in New England. We were a kind of a Byzantine delegation from the Caribbean, you know, in odd garb, and all spoke with accents and were seen evidently foreign. George Hernandez was there. Douglas Duane visited. The Reyes brothers participated. Eric Vogue was a student then in the program. Ana Alvarez also was a student in the program. And because of this, I suspect Frank Martinez was the teaching assistant. He came to visit often and described a New London to us that was mesmerizing. He advised us on what to draw, the Richardson train station, for instance, the Robert Mills Custom House, and to our surprise and delight, the vernacular, in fact, the whalers, captains' houses with their long side alleys for the drying of ropes, for instance. We went to visit Tappy and Vince at their house in New London, a garden party. Vince showed us, delightful garden party. Vince showed us the library upstairs and the need for having to reinforce the walls of the frame building. We stayed till an inordinate and embarrassing late hour. And we would meet again because we asked Tappy to lecture for us in the program, and she did at the Lyman Allen Museum, Art Museum, and she lectured on wallpaper in America. Vince told us that when he traveled to France, when they traveled to France, nobody paid attention to him because they were interested mostly in Tappy's book. They have good taste, he said. For us then, this time, this summer in New London was an extraordinary time, learning mostly from Vince about the sea, about the Caribbean, about the Mediterranean city building culture. He understood the Mediterranean architect very well. He understood Palladio very well, and he was, more than anyone else, the supportive of Aldo Rossi's project for the School of Architecture. We thought of ourselves as incredibly fortunate to have had this experience, or to be having this experience, and we reported positively back to the authorities in Miami of what an unbelievable experience it would be to have Tappy and Vince with us teaching here. And indeed it was. And they would be, of course, as you know, would make a defining contribution to the evolution of the School of Architecture. I also have an anecdote to share with you, a more recent experience. Maria LaGuardia and I were in Texas visiting a site. The host was describing the site to us in the most extraordinary way. The mountain, the escarpment, the river, the stream, the spring, the manantial, the spring, the manner in which a tree might sit at grade on the ground, the undulating surface of the terrain. At first I thought it reminded me of Wellington, who was a master of undulating terrain. But then I thought it wasn't quite that, because there was a reverence for the landscape in his words that was striking, compelling. So I asked him, I said, do you know the historian Vincent Scully? And he said, definitely. I was a student of his at Yale, and everything I know of landscape architecture, and of building for that matter, comes from Vincent Scully. What I learned was that, Vincent is significant, of course, to us, students of architecture, students of the city, those who are involved in the construction of schools of architecture, as we have been the last 25 years or so. But he also evidently has had a much broader influence, resonance, one that can only bring good in our lives and in our work. Thank you.
Liz, I want to thank you for this, for all of it, and not just today, but to you and Andres for being such dutiful students of Vince, that it opened the way for him and for Tappy to even consider coming here many years ago. It's funny, so you'll be able to judge the accuracy of a story told nearly twice, because much of what my dear friend Teofilo said, I'm going to repeat from perhaps a less poetic vantage point. So it was in the summer of 1990 that I met Vincent Scully at Yale, or rather in New Haven, and ended up in his attic after midnight. Just days beforehand, Tappy, his wife, had come to lecture to us, that is, the students and faculty, of what was then the first traveling summer studio, the New London Summer Design Studio, what now would be known to all of you as the Open City Studio phenomena. Shortly after her lecture, she invited us, students and faculty, to a cocktail party at their house. And so we arrived that weekend. The house and garden were lovely. The evening was perfect. And the graciousness of our host was such that together we tested the very elastic limits of what is called the cocktail hour, until such a strange and crazy time in the night that Vincent took the party upstairs to the attic. Here, in a whitewashed, wooden-shaped isosceles triangular space, much like a drawing by Aldo Rossi, we sat Indian style on the floor in a circle, surrounded by cardboard boxes. And Vince did what he always did. He began to teach. He opened a box and pulled out a stack of 8.5 by 11-inch white paper sheets. And on them were the iterative sketches, the studies that Robert Venturi had made for his mother's house. And so the voice sank in the gravelly fashion which you heard from the screen. And the hands began to gesture, and the pages flipped, and the words echoed past the white rafters, and we were transfixed. We became Boy Scouts, or maybe just Scouts, sitting around a campfire of one dim bulb and the blinding brilliance of his insight. From the sketches, Vince told the story of a young Robert Venturi working to find his own voice past the influence of his master, Lou Kahn, and it was enthralling. On the following Monday, I think my chronology is more accurate, by the way. On the following Monday, Vincent Tappy attended the final presentation of the students' work. We were all there. Teofilo was there. Jorge and Luis Treyes were there. Douglas had been there. Frank Martinez was there. I wasn't going to say the thing about Anna Frank, but Teofilo did. So there you go. And we taught the studio in a kind of relay style, with John Steffian being the coach. We were all there as we were on the eve of the cocktail party. And there, for the first time, Vince saw the types of drawings that would inspire him to write, Between Two Towers, the drawings of the School of Miami. Cows and commons, obelisks, flags and fences were drawn like Shaker plans or stitched like colonial samplers. And later, other drawings, alligators and mosquitoes, cheeky huts and Yucatan pyramids, Key West, the Straits of Florida, Vogt's Great Door, Rosario's portraits, her and Roberto's projects, the Ziff House, Palladian Villas, Seaside, Windsor, Key West, Spain's Colosseum, Charlie Barrett's Magic Black Ink, and more. 167 plates in total became the collection of the work. Of it, he wrote, "These drawings are, in my opinion, much the most beautiful being produced by any school of architecture at the present time." By 1991, Vincent Tappy had arrived in Miami and joined the faculty. He soon invited Teofilo and me to assist him with the book. We first presented him with a large sampling of student work and held long conversations about them all together. He met with faculty over their drawings over and over again. He derived great pleasure from this. We talked about Rossi and the Ziff Tower, about Merrick and his early plans for an outdoor campus of amphitheaters. Then Vince stitched it all together, and giving it shape, he wrote, "The first tower was Phineas Pace for the administration of building of the University of Miami. The second was Aldo Rossi's for the School of Architecture. The first was never built. The other two may never be built. They exist only as drawings. Between them, they illustrate, and indeed have partially shaped, the history of the school. But it was Vince who gave a name, a structure, and shape to what we were doing here. And Tappy, too, who in her article, Stone by Stone, John Ruskin's Path, contextualized it all in the 19th century debate about the virtue of drawing from nature versus abstracting it. They breathed life into us. Between Two Towers happened early in their tenure here and was their form of communion with us. And with Miami, this new place they made their springtime home for nearly 20 years. No historian of his stature has ever written about drawings made in a school of architecture by students and faculty together alike. This speaks of the core of who Vince was. Without fear, effort, or prejudice, he navigated the waters between high and low, between the vernacular and the grand manner, the everyday and the extraordinary, all in an effort to get at what really matters, our humanity, individually, collectively, and across time. In the ending narrative, he described the Everglades as such. There are the Everglades. There is the grass that Marjorie Stoneman Douglas made us understand. The boardwalk of Everglades National Park leads us to it. There finally is the hammock, South Florida's glory, packed with vegetable and animal life. And there are the graves before it, just barely like those of Uruk, and like them, they are all that is left of human beings who tenaciously worked and shaped the land. It is the beginning of everything and the underlying structure of everything. And those who draw it here in Miami, my parenthesis, are determined to make us see that and remember it, however old we grow. Thank you, Tappy, for being here with us today. Thank you for bringing Vince and for being here for those wonderful times and those many years. And thank you for Between Two Towers, a fitting remembrance of this place and those times. Thank you.
What they wanted, they and the patrons alike, was a new kind of relationship to the landscape, a new sense of belonging in it, a new sense of deriving some kind of sustenance and courage from it, and most of all, a new sense of belonging to the common memory of all mankind.
This painting by Durand, called Thanatopsis, which means roughly a view of death, best sums up all these attitudes.
The title is from a poem by William Cullen Bryant, very strange poem for a young man to write, in which he attempts to reconcile mankind to dying by pointing out that the majority of mankind lies dead in the earth, and that when one dies, one goes back, as it were, home to nature and becomes part of it. And the painting is like that. Under the trees, there's a quiet burial ceremony.
Up to the right, magnificent alpine masses loom, and castles of great antiquity rest upon them. But then, down toward the light, again as in the oxbow, goes the lovely garden, out to the transcendence of the distance. And so one is made to feel that in dying, in being put to rest in the earth, there is a great peace, and the earth itself celebrates the grandeur of the coming. And out beyond, in the distance, the light of transcendence flares.
All of that
speaks very close to American needs, it seems to me, at any time. For an American who travels to Europe, all of a sudden, there's the realization that there is another attitude toward death than ours, one in which it's more natural, precisely because the fathers for so many generations sleep there. And it's that attempt to reconcile Americans to death, to the common fate of all mankind. It's with that Thanatopsis, the poem and the painting, deal.
To him who in the love of nature holds communion with her visible forms, she speaks a various language. For his gayer hours, she has a voice of gladness and a smile and eloquence of beauty. And she glides into his darker musings with a mild and healing sympathy that steals away their sharpness ere he is aware. When thoughts of the last bitter hour come like a blight over thy spirit, and sad images of the stern agony and shroud and pall and breathless darkness in the narrow house make thee to shudder and grow sick at heart, go forth under the open sky and list to nature's teachings. So live, that when thy summons comes to join the innumerable caravan which moves to that mysterious realm where each shall take his chamber in the silent halls of death, thou go not like the quarry slave at night, scourged to his dungeon, but sustained and soothed by an unfaltering trust. Approach thy grave like one who wraps the drapery of his couch about him and lies down to pleasant dreams.
That's what it's about. That's what Americans are trying to find in the continent. They're trying to find that past, those fathers' graves. They'd like to belong here. It's not possession. The furniture doesn't do you that much good in that way. The silver, the great chests, the glossy clothes with the bright buttons on them. In the end, you own nothing. You go back. But you belong to the land you return to. And there's another kind of hope in transcendence.
And thank you all of you, for speaking so eloquently. I found at Yale that I didn't feel tearful. You all have brought me just about to tears. And I remember through you all, Vince was so ill we had to leave New Haven and go to my parents' house in Virginia. So for the last, where he could live on one story in our old house in New Haven, there were too many steps. He had Parkinson's, and he had it for about 10 years. But he got along so well, really until about 2 months before he died. And he talked. It's interesting to me thinking about it here. He talked with so much love and so much regret that he couldn't get back here. He talked about you all here, really more. This kid who grew up in New Haven and was a scholarship kid at Yale, he really talked about the University of Miami and wanting to come down here even more than wanting to get back to New Haven. We were able to take his ashes back to New Haven, and Yale certainly did a wonderful tribute to him, but nothing more wonderful than this. And thank you all. Thank you, Dean Alcoury, and thank you, Liz, and thank you all for welcoming us for those 20 years, and our dogs. We had to buy a dog house. We had to buy a house for the dog, and I'm happy I still have it, and we'll be back, I hope, next winter. And thank you all. And I'm to tell you, Liz, that there are wonderful things spread out to eat just across the breezeway there, and you're all invited.
like to thank all the speakers for sharing their stories and their thoughts, and especially Liz for orchestrating this wonderful program. And before we part, I would like to invite us all to also remember two members of the USOA community who also passed away this year, David Fix and Adrian Villaraus. Their legacy is also part of the school, and they will always be remembered fondly. Now, please do join us across the breezeway for some refreshments, and thank you very much for coming here today.